Last week, Bobby Miller, aka Humblefish, joined us to talk about fish disease, medications, hydrogen peroxide, and so much more. You can find a link to the full episode in the comment section. But our after party was so amazing, we decided we had to share it. So be sure to check out our other videos, but enjoy a sneak peek into the after party.
Well, I know that you all use hydrogen peroxide with seahorses for a lot of different applications, and it's just kind of coincidentally, I've been working on, and it's not just me, there's other people, you know, Jessica has also been experimenting with hydrogen peroxide, and we've kind of taken what's called tank transfer method, which is where you transfer the fish into a new aquarium every 3 days to you know, prophylactically treat for ick. And we're actually using peroxide. We're dosing hydrogen peroxide at 150 ppm for 30 minutes, 6 days apart. And what that treats is, we know it treats velvet because there's been a peer-reviewed study on it. And we're hoping it also treats brook, flukes, and other pathogens. And I was actually shocked to learn that you all use formalin because, you know, most scaleless fish don't, which I know seahorses are kind of their own thing, don't really handle formalin well, but I was actually surprised to learn that, you know, well, not only that peroxide, but formalin is used with seahorses sometimes.
Well, seahorses aren't a true scaleless fish. They actually have fused scales, is what makes it their exterior.
Okay.
So they don't really fall in that true scaleless fish category. Now, they're also different because their gill structure is different than regular fishes. They have a closed operculum. And the fact that they have the fixed jaw, and it's like a tube, if you will, you know, they have a propensity to get ciliates and parasites trapped in the oral cavity and in the gills.
Okay.
And when you look at seahorses like ick and some of the other exterior things that you would normally see on fish, you don't normally see those on seahorses, but they can affect it within the oral cavity and the gills. So usually when they have an ick infection, you won't see it, but it'll be inside the gills.
Okay. And that's actually similar to some fish that we treat, like wrasses are a very good example. Any fish that have a thick mucus layer like wrasses and clownfish, I mean, you normally do not see ick or velvet like evidence on the skin, but you'll actually see inside the gills. Yeah. It's usually where it attacks first. Basically, it suffocates the fish to death because the immune response, when the excess mucus starts to build up around the feeding trophonts, then literally cuts off the fish's ability to breathe and die. So it kind of sounds like from that standpoint, maybe seahorses are similar to wrasses, for example, where they don't get it on the skin, they get it inside the gills, most likely.
Yeah, it's rare that you'll see, you know, unless you're talking about, you know, some larger things other than, you know, ciliates. When you start getting into parasitic copepods and things like that, they'll affect the outside, but it takes a pretty big thing to really mess with them on the outside. Now, sometimes things will grow on the outside, you know, whether it's hydroids or, you know, people have even had aptasia growing on a seahorse. You know, they're unique because they're so sedentary that things will land on them and can, you know, they're not constantly moving about. So they're prone to certain things like that can happen, although not very common. But with the formalin, even babies, you know, when we have a batch of fry, the very first day we start a round of formalin for, you know, long-term immersion, you know, dosed at normal dose every other day, 3 times. And even babies, I've dosed up to 2 times the normal dose with success without any ill effect.
So is that, when you say the normal dose, is that like the 15 to 25 ppm?
25 parts per million.
Okay, so that's like more like so have you ever tried a 150 ppm 30-minute bath on a seahorse?
We do actually 250 at 45 minutes.
Okay, and they tolerate that?
Oh yeah, very well.
Is the 250 ppm, is that in water that's 70 degrees or cooler? Is that cool water? Or it's regular reef temperatures? Wow.
Well, most people don't keep seahorses at reef temperatures. We usually have them in the mid to lower 70s. So, but it's not a requirement. It's not a requirement. And I've done it before at 78, 79 degrees, but you need to have aeration, obviously, to keep the water going, you know.
Yeah, because formalin robs the water of oxygen.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, the general rule is basically 70 degrees and above, then it's 150 ppm. And if it's below 70 degrees, it's 150 ppm. I know actually one of our quarantine vendors actually does it at 200 ppm on all new arrivals and doesn't have any more problems with that than 150. And that's primarily to keep out Uronema, because we just had one of our vendors, Uronema just took out everything. It just wiped out their thousands of dollars worth of fish. And then I'm getting word from other local fish stores that I deal with that same thing is happening. There's some Uronema going through the supply chain right now, and it's just taking out everything.
My understanding is Uronema can develop resistance to formalin.
Oof. So then the only other treatment then for Uronema that seemed to show promise was chloroquine, which is now off market. So
well,
yeah,
metrodiazole will have some effect.
we actually have, and he might be interested to see. So we have like on the forum, it's it's basically so everybody that does hybrid tank transfer method, and then they document it, or sometimes what they'll do is in a specific thread, they will post the fish that they run through peroxide and whether it was success or failure. So I've got like a whole list on the forum of fish that have been treated by myself and others, and whether it was success or failure. So far, I think we just had one person that did 3 line seahorses, and they were all successful. He did them at 150 ppm for 30 minutes.
Anyways.
Yeah, Dan, I just posted a link back to my forum, and you'll see we call it our fish peroxide compatibility list, and you'll see a list of all the different species that we've, not just myself, but others, a lot of others have tested peroxide on, the 150 ppm bath, and as you can see, mostly successful.
Have you looked at the studies on peroxide baths for fish?
There are some others, but the primary study was the one that I posted the abstract of. That was where they the fish that they actually purposely infected with velvet, and then they ran them through the 2 peroxide baths 6 days apart, and then after the second bath, the level, they did like gill and skin scrapes, the level was undetectable.
I've read probably close to a dozen different studies, but most of these are geared towards food fish. But the dosing seems to be all over the place, and it seems to be some fish handle higher doses better than other fish. Some of the doses have been much higher than what you're talking about.
Well, in this study, they tried 300 ppm, and it was 100% mortality rate.
Yep.
So when I saw that, I was like, we're not going to go any higher than that.
I didn't have enough time. When I really got into the peroxide, I was kind of hesitant, and I was short at staff because I had lost my wife, and I didn't have the wherewithal to do what I wanted to do in terms of testing with that. I would really like to know what the tolerance is for seahorses, but I haven't challenged it high enough to be comfortable to say how much they can handle. I know what I've done, but what I've done has been relatively low dosing. What I used to do with mine is I would dose them at about 10 to 15 parts per million, turn the sump off, and I got a bare bottom system, for aquaculture, and I would just circulate the water in the tank without running through the sump until the peroxide level would drop, and I could test it to find out. When I used to collect seawater, when I collected it, I'd filter it down to 1 micron, and then I would bleach it 250 parts per million for a minimum of 4 to 6 hours. Then I would pump it into my first tower and circulate it. And then when I was ready to use it, I would add peroxide to bring the chlorination down to 0, and then pump it over to my tower that I pumped water from.
Does it work on chloramines or only chlorine?
Chlorine. It might break apart the chloramines. I never had to deal with chloramines because once the city changed over to chloramines, I quit using the city water, and started collecting seawater.
Okay.
But it works very well as a dechlorination agent. And the nice thing is that there's no residual because it turns into, chlorine's a gas and peroxide's water and oxygen.
Yeah, it has enormous potential. I mean, it really has enormous potential because I can't tell you how many times I, people have sick fish. I mean, the go-to treatment is copper. The fish are in copper. The fish are not doing well in copper. And I don't really know at that point, is the pathogen killing the fish or is the copper killing the fish? So I have more confidence that peroxide isn't killing the fish at least than copper. So I'm really trying to find a way just basically just to get away from copper if possible.
You've talked about how copper, the parasites become resistant. Is there a chance that will happen with peroxide also?
If the wholesalers get a hold of it. So it just seems like whatever we come up with that can help the hobby, they subvert. So, copper is a good example. They're like, oh, well, copper at a certain therapeutic range will treat parasites. They're like, whoa, but if we treat it, I think the most common for chelated is like 1.0 ppm, that will manage the parasites to a
Right.
sublethal concentration, but it doesn't completely eliminate them. So then, and I have sources who have told me some of the larger wholesale facilities have not sterilized their system since the early 90s.
Oh,
So we're talking about parasites that have been exposed to sublethal copper for what, 30 years now? And it just seems to me, now a friend of mine who is a chemist says it should take a lot longer for strains of parasites to develop resistance to medications, but we're seeing way too many examples of people coming in. We just had another one where I think they treated it close to 2.5 ppm chelated copper. They treated for 30 days, and I think it actually was velvet came back. How is that possible? That to me was, I mean, I was quarantining fish in the early 90s, and we were using copper safe, and we weren't even testing the levels, and I worked for this company for almost 4 years. We probably quarantined thousands of fish. We never had a case of ichor velvet make its way into a client's tank. So how is this now becoming commonplace where 30 years ago it was unheard of?
But the thing is, though, peroxide is going to be different than a chemical because peroxide is an oxidizer.
Right.
So it's killing by oxidation. I have not developed any resistance to it because every time I spill it on me, it still burns like an SOB.
Well, and speaking of resistance too, Bay Bridge Aquarium, Bobby, he was treating at 3 parts per million copper power and was still
Wow.
seeing velvet trophonts on gill clippings under the microscope. So
it like what Jessica's saying, we're kind of getting to the point with the hobby where it's not going to be too long until copper is not really a viable treatment option. So we're just trying to get ahead of the game right now by saying, okay, well, if copper isn't going to work, what can replace it? What can we use instead? And we really like hydrogen peroxide as a possible replacement treatment.
I love it.
And to be honest too, and Bobby's not going to like this, I think the prophylactic treatment has a lot to do with it because it's like antibiotics. I don't take antibiotics unless I have a bacterial infection that really needs it. I don't take them prophylactically. And that's how you get superbugs, is by using drugs that you don't need to use. And so I think we actually do more damage prophylactically treating for things that aren't necessarily there and exposing these fish to these medications unnecessarily. And that damages their immune systems if there are any parasites there that don't necessarily need it. You know what I'm saying? Like,
all too often, doctors will just write out a prescription for an antibiotic because they don't know. It's just, well, it might be this, so we'll just go ahead and do that. And you got to use the right antibiotic for the right thing, or else, you're wasting your efforts and you're creating resistance. And even more important is such a wide use of antibiotics. We're finding that antibiotics are ending up through our water supplies and out into the environment, to where things in the environment are becoming resistant to it because they're exposed to it at low levels.
That's one of the things I forgot to ask you, Bobby. I wanted to ask that question, what to look for. How can you tell if a seahorse or fish has a problem?
So I actually it's somewhere on the forum, I wrote an article like how to pick out a healthy fish.
Mm-hmm.
And I talk about, because nowadays, a lot of people order online, you never know what you're going to get, but if you still will go into a local fish store and pick out a fish. And there were things like, for example, any fish that to me is hiding, has clamped fins, if you see scratching, if you see head shaking, any of those, behavioral symptoms of disease. I mean, unless you're wanting a challenge and, or you're getting a discount on the fish, you might want to not buy the fish. To me, the number one thing to always do, you go into a local fish store and you see a fish you're in love with, ask the owner or the employee to feed the fish. Yeah,
That's one
ask
of our
them to
big
feed the
things.
fish, because I mean, if the fish is healthy, the fish is going to eat. If the fish has a problem, it's probably not going to eat. And then you're literally you could be buying a fish that won't even eat. It's just going to starve to death, in your care. And look, when you see the owner or the employee feed, what did they feed? And I'm not leaving that store until I leave the store with whatever I saw that fish eat. If they're using it, they're selling it.
Yeah.
So that, to me, because that's the number one problem, that people quarantine fish, and for whatever reason, the fish doesn't eat, the fish never eats, the fish starves to death. So yeah, that's the number one thing. And this is going to sound a little cheeky, but another little thing you can do, especially if you have a fish that is like being very friendly, which I can't tell you how many times my wife and I have bought fish just because they were being so friendly to us, and they're right along the glass. You can actually use like the magnifying app that's on your phone. And if you can actually get there and like look at the fish, there's a lot of times you will see evidence of like flukes or parasite trophonts using a magnifying glass that you can't see with the naked eye. Wow. So that's another little thing you can do to be like, there's something slowly crawling over this fish. Maybe it's flukes. Maybe I don't want to buy the fish. Or at the very least, you're like, if I see a monogenian like actually on, slowly crawling over the scales, maybe I need to treat with Pro or General Cure before copper.
Is that I wish the feeding the fish would work with seahorses as an indicator. Problem is that sometimes they have a low level thing that's starting that doesn't show up until later on. And all too often people will go into a store, they'll see it feed, take it home, and 2 weeks later lose the animal. And unfortunately with seahorses, that's the case.
So to add to Bobby's recommendations for what to look for, there's a store near us that is on the surface the best store in the area. Their fish always look fantastic. They have a huge selection, but they have velvet. And I know that because I've had 2 tank wipeouts thanks to them. And I know other people in the area who have had tank wipeouts thanks to them. And you'd never know it looking at the fish. They look healthy. They look, they're mobile. They're out and about. They're feeding well. He runs UV on his systems and he runs copper. And you just can't see that from the surface. And so things that I look for is if there are inverts or corals in with their fish, they're not running copper in that case. And look for UV. Look to see if there's UV plumbed into the system, because you can usually see the sumps, you can see the water lines, because they'll have the systems all plumbed together. So those are 2 other things I look for, is just to see how their systems are set up and if they're set up in such a way that could potentially be hiding something.
Yep.
And look at every other fish in the tank, because if one has
and like my wife saying, she's listening here in the background, like look at every other fish in the tank, because if one fish has something and all the systems are plumbed together, well then all the fish have it, because it's sharing the diseases. She's saying all of them in that tank at least look, because if you see one fish displaying symptoms of disease or even behavioral symptoms, that every fish in that tank is exposed and is likely going to be contaminated. And like Jessica was saying, I mean, look, these local fish stores are crafty. There's all kind of different management techniques. I mean, there's subtherapeutic copper, there's a UV sterilizer. I actually Herbtania. So I actually knew a local fish store in where I used to live, and he actually dosed every day Herbtania and Artemis, which are herbal remedies for parasites and bacteria. And the fish always looked amazing. They looked amazing. But I can't tell you how many times people would buy fish from him, take them home, and in 2 or 3 days I was getting text messages and phone calls. They're like, oh my God, all my fish are dying from velvet. Well, he was suppressing the symptoms with those herbal remedies, but then when the guy even told you, if you're going to buy fish from me, you're basically going to have to dose this stuff for the rest of your life. But some people weren't going to do that. They would take them home, put them in their tank, and then all hell would break loose. I just wrote an article actually on how, because now it's like everybody and their brother is, quarantining saltwater fish. And I just wrote an article on how you can tell if it's being done properly. And yeah, I mean, you want to ask when this doesn't apply to seahorses, but you want to ask very, very specific questions about okay, what medications are you using? At what therapeutic levels are you treating at? How long are the treatments? I mean, anybody that sells quarantine fish that cannot provide that information, yeah, there's something wrong. And I also say there's issues of quarantine fish being sold. If you're going to buy a quarantine fish, you're going to pay 50 to 100% above retail, because if the fish is actually being quarantined properly, the vendor has to make money, and the vendor is
Right.
not going to make money unless they're charging 50 to 100% above retail when you consider their time and effort and everything else.
You know, if I had a seahorse that was sick and I had to treat it, I would treat, but I wouldn't sell that seahorse. And we got to the point to where we stopped treating seahorses. We just removed anything that appeared to be wrong and put them down, because I didn't want to ship out animals that had been treated with antibiotics. And for a long time, we had a misfit tank where every animal that had something wrong with it, whether it was a congenital deformity or whether it was something we treated, and I used to treat to prove how to do it. I had a seahorse that had tail rot so bad it lost its entire tail. I kept
Wow.
the seahorse for 5 years without a tail. Um, he adapted to the environment, and I was good at treating, but I don't want to send out an animal that I've treated. Now it's different treating with formalin, but I'm talking about bacterial infections and, things that go beyond just a simple formalin treatment to keep the ciliates down. Um, and, most people that are, I won't say most, a reputable breeder is more concerned about their reputation than they are the quick sale. And, you've got somebody like that, even if you do get something wrong, that they're going to try to do everything in their power to take care of you. And the measurement that I used was, and if you go back since 2003, try to find negative reviews of us selling stuff.
You won't find them.
It's
Hey,
very
but when you were
difficult.
talking about formalin though, why is that different? Is it because of what you just explained, that ciliates are always present in a tank, and so you're just trying to minimize, versus Uronema or whatever could be completely not in a tank? Is that the deal?
Well, they're a
No.
parasite, not a disease, is the way I see it.
Okay.
Okay. The other thing is this: if you take a newborn erectus and put them in a tank and do not treat with formalin for the first week, you're going to end up starting to lose them. And you look at the success rate of hobbyists trying to breed seahorses. They're very sensitive to ciliates at a very young age. So if you don't keep the ciliates knocked back, you're going to have issues.
So being that formalin contains formaldehyde, it's a known carcinogen, are there any life expectancy issues that you've noticed when treating seahorses with formalin? There's some people that claim that fish that are treated with formalin in some instances only live about 18 to 24 months. And then I've even seen some posts where when they do the necropsy, they find cancer inside the fish.
Well, let me tell you a couple of things. First of all, regular fish are different than seahorses because seahorses don't go through metamorphosis. And
Okay.
treating fish before they go through metamorphosis can be problematic. When I first started using formalin, I was talking with the guys with the USDA locally at the Smithsonian and Harbor Branch, where they were doing food fish studies, and they said if you use formalin at a young age, they'll become sterile. So I was very hesitant to start. My wife said, "Screw this, they're scratching," so she added it. And we went for
Abby
2 or
was
3
awesome.
years of trying to find out, and we found that I've got many customers that have had seahorses for 7, 8, 10 years, and not had a problem. And every seahorse I've sold has been at one time or another treated with formalin, and in some cases multiple times. Formalin is known as a carcinogenic, but most people don't realize our bodies produce formalin. Formalin is found in a large percentage of makeup. Formalin is found in all of our building materials. It's used in making medications. Formalin is all over the place. And the government has come out with their attempt to cut back the use of formalin when they changed it from may cause to does cause cancer, that put a huge liability on companies producing it. So you saw it dry up on the market because of the liability issue. But it's still, even today, I mean, most of the vaccinations that you take, these anti-vaxxers, one of the big problems they have is the fact that formalin is in so many vaccines.
Because it's the activator.
Well, no, it's a sterilizer.
Okay.
It's used as a sterilizer and a preservative.
Okay. That
Every
makes
time
sense.
you recommend formalin, Dan, in a recent Wine Wednesdays, you always say wear gloves and be careful.
I
Mhm.
do. I mean, realistically, the most
But it's big in Seahorse world. That's right.
it can be absorbed through the hands, or through the skin. But the biggest way that you're going to get it is through inhalation. If we go around and tried to dose all of our tanks, you couldn't walk in that room. You'd be choking on the damn smell of formalin because it's a
Yeah.
gas.
So do you do the formalin bath like in a closed environment, or do you try to do it like outside, sort of where it's well ventilated?
No, it ends up being well ventilated because the room that I had the seahorses in, when we first dosed, we'd walk out of the room and let it, go for a little while, but we're in and out, in and out, in and out. The AC is running constantly. I mean, it's the air is circulating in there I was looking at a 4-digit electric bill when I was breeding.
And
Wow.
Holly, real quick, Holly, real quick, when you started adding formalin to your fry tanks, it made a huge difference, right?
Oh, instant success. That and peroxide really made a huge difference in survival. And I use it just any day that I see itching, I put the formalin in. Doesn't kill them. They don't get sick. Yeah, it's usually just while they're on the live brine shrimp till I get them trained to frozen. I'll do formalin. Yeah,
That's an
whenever.
interesting connection too.
After you're done and they're doing frozen, I don't have the issue anymore with them.
Now, one of the things that we do that you'll find interesting with the peroxide is that there was a study done in Europe on using aquaculture for reducing pathogen levels in live feeds. And what we do with our Artemia, several things that we do actually, but the first thing is that people talked about the sterilization of the, cleaning the scratches and all that stuff, is that people don't realize that when you keep hatching Artemia, you end up with biofilms on everything. So you've got to keep the equipment, the vessels clean, the equipment clean. And then when we go to hatch Artemia, I put probiotics during the hatch. When I harvest the hatch, I actually sterilize it. And I use 8,000 milligrams per liter for 5 minutes with the Artemia to sterilize them. Think about that for a minute, 8,000 milligrams per liter.
Wow.
So, we put it in for a minute and a half with the bubbler, turning it over and getting it, mixed in real well. Then we pull the airline and let it settle. And roughly 90% of the Artemia survive the process. And that's how we get rid of most of the bacteria in the Artemia. And then we move it to enrichment. And again, we add the enrichment and the probiotics. And that makes a huge difference, especially with bacterial enteritis, of the gut. The organic loading of the tank, there's just no two ways around it. You're going to have it. And the problem is with seahorses, you can't run high flow. So you have a low flow environment with high organics. So, you're, as much as you're trying to clean up the water, your only choice is to use some type of a chemical agent to knock back the ciliates.
Right.
Obviously with crypto and velvet, you can fallow out a tank, get rid of it. You can quarantine all your inverts, corals, macroalgae, all of that for that fallow period, and know you're introducing, I guess, crypto and velvet free non-fish, for lack of a better word, to your aquarium. But what absolutely terrifies me is like all the other things that aren't ick and velvet, stuff like Uronema. Do you have any suggestions or any other like tips or things you can do for non-fish, for quarantining non-fish?
So like for corals or inverts, unfortunately, because they don't tolerate chemicals, then you can do you can do a coral dip. There's people actually even use, there is like people that do peroxide dips on their corals or inverts, but I don't feel that will kill the tomotes, because everything research I've done on ick tomotes is it takes 60 ppm chlorine 24 hours to kill ictomos. And I mean, you think about that, that's very strong chlorine. So I just don't feel that, you know, the little coral dips or peroxide can kill, whereas they may be able to kill, like on the fish, the trophonts, or maybe the free swimmers. It's the tomons, the encysted stage, which is what you're going to find on the corals and inverts. That is the stage that the only thing that gets rid of it is time. You have to put it in I recommend put it in a fishless tank, a fishless coral invert QT, raise the temperature to 80.6 degrees Fahrenheit if they'll tolerate that, and wait 6 weeks. And then when the tomons release the free swimmers, they're not going to find a fish host, and they're basically going to starve to death. And that's how you break the life cycle.
But I think she's talking about Uronema, which doesn't have a
Yeah.
fallow period.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. So that's the thing with Uronema, because it is a parasite with it doesn't require a fish host. I mean, Uronema can subsist off of detritus, organics, bacteria. There's no like fishless or fallow period for Uronema. But Uronema also doesn't have an encysted stage. It's a parasite with a direct life cycle, which means it's only going to be loosely attached if it is present on a coral or invert. It's going to sound a little maybe oversimplistic, but what I actually do is, before I put the coral or invert into my DT, I have it like a colander, and I just take a picture of tank water, and I just rinse it very, very thoroughly. And what the hope is that if there are any loosely attached Uronema parasites or brook or anything else, it will rinse those away, because they're not actually encysted on a hard part of the coral or invert.
You know,
Gotcha.
Uronema is really, we should consider it a commensal organism, because it's ever present, and in small numbers it's not a problem. But high organics is going to become a problem, and if you put it into a tank where there's no organic loading, they're going to die off.
Right. So, and I've also found that with Uronema, there's only certain species of fish that seem to be susceptible. I mean, the most obvious are chromis. They just seem to be, yeah, chromis, anthias seem to be susceptible. Sometimes butterflies and large angels are susceptible to it. But you're probably right. It's probably one of those diseases. It's ever present. If you can keep the tank clean, for lack of a better word, then you're denying it a food source, and probably it's not going to be a problem.
Yeah, it makes sense. It's just the idea of having like a completely clean display tank, which I'd like
Is that
to
even
be
possible? You
for
think
more
that's
people.
possible?
Well,
But Marina, you think it's possible?
Largely, yes. I know that's not a popular opinion, but I think largely, yes. I think there's very few things that you can't eradicate with enough effort. I'm not saying it's the best solution for everyone, and I don't think it's the right choice for everything, but I think it's doable. But maybe I'm just annoying and optimistic.
Sorry.
actually, look, I'm gonna disagree, because I mean, you sit here and think about this. So what do we treat for? Crypto, velvet, brook, Uronema. I mean, think about the thousands of different diseases that we humans can be afflicted by. I mean, I think it's logical to assume that there's probably thousands of different strains of parasites and worms and bacteria that we don't ever treat, that do probably make their way into our DTs. And it's kind of like, well, then that's where, you know, like you do the best you can in quarantine to clean the fish as best you can. But then once you move the fish into the DT environment, you have to do things like, you know, keep the tank clean, low organics, boost the fish's immune system. It's a 2-tier approach, because you're hoping to knock off the most virulent diseases in quarantine, and then whatever survives and whatever makes it into the DT, you're then counting on the fish's immune system and good tank husbandry to keep those other pathogens sublethal.
With the tank being clean, I don't think we can eradicate it of everything in the world that could go wrong. But I do believe we can at least knock out most of the big bad things. Like, I think it's very possible to have a velvet-free tank.
Oh, sure.
Or a crypto-free tank.
Well, and really, sterility is not a good thing. It's just not. I think that's one of our biggest problems is that we start these tanks with dry rock and, absolutely no bacteria in it. You're using bottled bacteria. You're not using live rock. You're not using live sand. And it's just giving everything the opportunity to, it's giving the bad stuff the opportunity to proliferate because there's nothing good to knock it out.
But what about the bad
think
stuff?
about
Well,
taking
Stuff.
I agree with what you're saying, but I'm going to argue against it. And
Okay.
that is that when you take a little box and we create this little micro environment, okay, the problem we have is that it never stays sterile. I had a
Sure.
breeder from Australia. We got into a long, drawn out argument over, he was saying that if I made my tanks too sterile, my seahorses wouldn't have the hardiness of dealing with stuff. And my argument against that is that in the environment that we have many of the things that we have in the outside environment, maybe not as many parasites, but the bacteria are ever present. And the opportunity for the bacteria to grow in larger numbers in a small environment is very much the case as opposed to a big ocean.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
so,
Absolutely. I mean, that's why I like the peroxide dosing, right?
right.
Though,
But
so
but my point is that I did everything I could to make my environments as sterile as possible, but yet I had a reputation for having seahorses that were hardier than most because
Well,
there really wasn't a sterile environment. I started with one, but as soon as you start, that time it's sterile, but after that it's not.
I'll make a counterpoint to that. So okay, so if you look at, and this is more in the fish world, but when you look at the people that are always like, oh my God, I got velvet, I have diseases in my tank. The problem is it is usually new hobbyists, but it's new hobbyists that they set up their tank with dry rock and then they just seed it with some bacteria in a bottle product. If you ever look at the ones who say, man, I don't quarantine, I've never quarantined, and I've never seen a disease in my tank, it's always older, more experienced hobbyists that usually have a DT that's 10, 15, 20 years old. And the point where I'm going with this is I once had a conversation with Dr. Colomarni, who is actually, he's done a lot of research into crypto and everything. And he suggested to me that certain strains of bacteria actually prey upon parasite tomotes. So what that kind of has always been in my hand is like, okay, parasites, they have to have natural predators. Everything has a natural predator. Are
Sure.
there possible strains of bacteria that someone setting up a tank with dry rock would not have, but then someone that's had a tank set up 5, 10, 15 years has introduced that strain of bacteria, and these bacteria actually gnaw on, damage the tomotes before they can release free swimmers?
Dan, because I
Well,
love that, and I that's a damn question I meant to ask you during the stream too. Is that an established tank meaning more? But and in the seahorse world, I'm gonna let Dan talk, promise. But just we're all about start dry so that you don't introduce the bad. But you're right, you're not introducing the good either.
But you know what? 10, 20, 30 years ago, there was no such thing as dry rock. There was
Right.
basically everything was live rock. We would just get it out of the ocean. Of course, you had the die off that would cause the ammonia spikes. Of course, you might get a manna shrimp out of it, but that was the norm. And we didn't have all these disease problems. But it seems like nowadays everybody's just, going all dry rock and then just using a bacteria product to seed their tank. Well, look at that. All of a sudden now, it seems every other tank has got ick or velvet running rampant.
Oh my gosh, I have to hear Dan's response.
I can tell you from past experience in dealing with, so many years with customers, that the customers that start with dry rock for seahorse tanks, I'm not talking about fish tanks, coral tanks, etc., but customers that start with dry rock generally do much better with their seahorses than people that go and buy, live rock and a bunch of other things and just throw it in the tank. I've seen it with both wild caught and with captive bred. And um, the thing is that part of what happens is it's how fast they stock the tank. If you buy live rock and you put some bacteria in there, add the fish, you really don't have a stable system yet. If that system has a chance to age, I don't care, what you do, bacteria are going to inhabit that system. A good example of that is leave a steak out on the counter. or a glass of water. Leave a glass of water on the counter for a week. Would you drink it? If not, why? You know, because there's things in the air that are going to inhabit, and um, the tank is going to become populated with different things over time. The key is to keep those things in the correct numbers so that they're not, and keep that virulent gene from getting turned on. You know, if you've got the wrong environment, you've got a stressed out fish in there, you've got the bacteria, the temperature's too high, too low, whatever, and that virulent gene gets turned on, that bacteria just goes nuts. And then you look at the reproduction of what bacteria can do. I mean, it's mind numbing how fast they can reproduce.
Oh yeah. Yeah, gram-negative bacteria. I mean, you get the wrong like vibro, it could kill your fish faster than velvet. It's like, and to me, a happy compromise is because I mean, it's pretty difficult nowadays to stock a tank with 100% live rock. But what I say to people is like, okay, use your dry rock. That's more, and it's more eco-friendly and it's more economical. But then there are places that do sell live rock still. Order maybe a couple of pieces of live rock, put them in your tank, and just to get that biodiversity in the tank, at least get an introduction to the biodiversity that will then spread onto the rest of the rock. It will take longer, but I mean, at least it's present.
Well, with seahorses too, we got to worry about aptasia and all that, the hitchhikers. Do
Okay.
you agree with oh God, curing? Is that the word? Curing the rock? No?
Not really. I mean, so, and this is going to sound weird. Actually, I was at a presentation with Tony Vargas, and actually what he said made a lot of sense to me. So what he does when he sets up a tank, he uses 100% live rock to set up a tank for a client. And what he does is he actually like, I don't know, like lays out like towels. He takes the live rock, sets it on the towels for like several hours, and that will kill most of the bad stuff on the rock. I mean, if there's a manna shrimp, it's going to come out and everything. And yes, you are going to lose a lot of the life on that rock, but you are going to preserve the bacteria and the other helpful organisms on the rock. They're going to survive as long as they stay somewhat hydrated. You put them in the tank and then you have the benefit from it.
Where does everyone think the responsibility to quarantine should lie? Should it be wholesalers, distributors, LFSs, hobbyists?
Great question. Go, Bobby.
It's got to be done at, well, in most cases it has to be done at the hobbyist level. I mean, the wholesalers, they're not going to ever do that. I can tell you right now that doing it at the retail level, which I've done it at the retail level, and there's vendors on my forum doing it at the retail level, they're not making money. They're, you know, I mean, because like we had a vendor, and I mean, it's a sad story because he had 6 shipments in a row where he had like a 83%, I think it was, success rate or better at 60, 70 fish at a time, getting his batches of fish through quarantine. And I think he had 2, all from the same wholesaler. And then there was 2 times he had a 100% success rate. And that's obviously what we want. We want every single fish that we run through quarantine. We want to, put them into retail. They're disease free, and we want to sell healthy fish. And then he just got hit with Uronema, lost every single fish. So he went from having 6 or 7, or I'm sorry, 6 in a row, which was highly successful. And I mean, he's feeling great about this. He's even talking to me about, I think maybe I could even open up a commercial location and yada, yada, yada. And then he gets hit with Uronema, loses everything, and he's just lost thousands of dollars. And I mean, he's not going to recoup that because, I mean, you can't recoup money on dead fish. So he's just got to bleach all of his tanks and start over. But from a financial point of view, I just don't. I mean, I'm not saying you can't make a little bit of money, but you're not going to, it's not going to be worth it for most retailers to quarantine on a commercial level. So what does that leave us? That leaves us with the hobbyist.
Earn and burn. My problem is that I'm highly specific. Ask me a question about seahorses, I probably know the answer. Ask me a question about coral, I probably don't. Same thing with most other fish. I don't know much of anything because all I did, I started from scratch, not knowing a damn thing, and became a breeder. And
The best.
I haven't done anything else. The only thing I know is seahorses.
And that's kind of how it is on our forum. It's like, well, I'm the fish disease guy, and then there's some other guys that are good DIYers, and there's another guy that's he's into like SPS corals, like he's the guy that grows all the successful SPS, and then we've got a lot of people that are specific. They have specific skill sets, and we're blessed to have that because when a question comes up on an SPS coral, I'm like, well, I'm not touching that. Somebody else will answer it. With your expertise, I think we'll actually have, like, I actually was looking at some of the comments. We had one or two people saying, hey, just watching this makes me want to set up a seahorse tank.
Right.
Is this a true forum?
Yes, we actually have. Okay, so my thing was, I used to be a moderator on Reef to Reef, and I won't get into all that, but one of the things that bothered me was I hate censorship. I just hate it. I mean, my always thing is let people talk about what they want to talk about, and we'll work it out. We don't have to delete stuff and whatever. So when I started my forum, I'm like, yeah, we're going to talk about pretty much everything. If people want to talk about politics or religion and all these things that you're not supposed to talk about in a forum, as long as they keep it civil, we're going to allow it. So what we did is we created a subforum called the Fight Club Lounge. I think Jessica actually came up with the name. And what we do is any of these hot button topics, they're discussed in that. It's all contained in that one subforum. It does not show up in the feed, so not everybody sees it. And the only way you see it is if you go to Fight Club Lounge and want to participate. If you don't ever want to see that, we have greatly enhanced ignore features where you can ignore people, you can ignore entire subforums without what you can make it, you can customize your viewing experience so the Fight Club Lounge stuff, and it doesn't even exist to you.
The reason I like forums is that they're much easier to find information than, Facebook. Somebody writes a post and 2 days later, try to find it. I could go back, when I used to go on to seahorse.org, I would click the button, see all new posts. So I could see, a list of everything that was new, and anything that I was interested in, I could click on, answer, or, comment or whatever, or just view it and move on. Facebook, it sucks when you got people come on there. You get the same questions over and over and over and over, that they can't see the simple stuff that's already posted, that's right there at their fingertips to look at.
One other thing that I wanted to add to Marina's question earlier about, completely eradicating things. I started out with that, trying to go that way, doing the quarantining and everything. And what I've found and what I've noticed is that it makes people really jumpy. Like, you see a spot on a fish and they freak out.
Yeah.
And I think that that's more harmful to panic. Pull the fish, throw them into a QT tank. Now you're throwing them in through copper. You don't even know what's wrong, right? And it's just, the reason I went to peroxide was because really I've only been in the hobby 2 years, and it about drove me out, with the velvet and then worrying about every little spot. And the peroxide dosing just made it so that I don't worry about it. I see a spot. Okay, well, let's see what develops. Oh, there's a couple spots. I'm going to start dosing peroxide again, and that's going to bring it back down. And it just, I can see why people would want to get away from, try to make it so that none of that stuff is even present, but so stressful, right? So, I kind of take a little more laid back approach to it now. And now that I have the peroxide and the UV, I just don't worry that much about it.
I love that, and I want to push that because I agree 100%. And often on Wednesday, I worry that we get too technical and too into, oh my gosh, people message and be like, oh shit, I'm not doing seahorses now if it takes all that. And I'm like, no, it really doesn't. We're trying to cover everything and help you, but it's not that hard.
I'm just gonna say, yeah, we do sometimes scare people off a little with the seahorses, and then you have a chat to them and you're like, no, it's actually not, they're not as hard as they seem. We're just we sort of dwell a little bit on all the worst case scenarios and how to solve problems.
Right.
And so what people see is all the problems.
Right.
But
the problem is that all too often people spout out answers without knowing what's really going on. I was always taught to get a full history. If you look at how doctors are supposed to operate, they do a history, they do an exam,
Yes.
And then the diagnostic stuff they do is to confirm what they've already suspect. And when you've got somebody that gives you a 1 sentence problem and you're going to spout out an answer, I mean, it's like, I got a stomach ache. Well, you don't know if it's, I mean, ordering a hysterectomy for a guy is not very productive. I mean, you don't know whether it's, you know, what's going on. There's many different things that can be going on. And I've often found that when I get a complete history, it's often something very simple. And not every situation requires a medication. And I have a tendency of, when I'm dealing with customers, to be a little bit slower than most people at recommending medications until I really understand what's going on and if it's needed. Because seahorses, I mean, they're like a freaking 2-year-old. If they can get in trouble, they will. And sometimes, you know, somebody sees a little white spot and it could be a pigmentation issue, not a bacterial issue. And, you know, you really need to understand what's going on before you sit here and say, all right, put them in a hospital tank. Let's give them Furon 2. Let's give them triple sulfa. Let's do 50% water changes every day. Drop the temperature to 69. That's often, you know, people will complain about something and they get all these directions to do all this stuff and then find out that there really was nothing wrong with the animal to begin with.
And look, what Jessica was saying, that might be the future of the hobby. We just don't know yet, where it's like basically gets what she considers to be a reasonably clean fish from a reliable source. You get the fish should be eating. You give the fish a peroxide bath, and then you put it, you know, to knock off the most virulent pathogens. Then you put in your DT and just utilize management techniques for whatever might be left over. That may end up being the future of the hobby, at least the fish side of the hobby. But what we're at right now is trying to figure out, what does peroxide, what does it, and what does it not eliminate in one bath. So we kind of know more like, okay, well, maybe it knocks off Velvet and Brook, but maybe it doesn't do anything for Uronema. Maybe it doesn't do anything for ick. Maybe there's times when flukes slip through. So at least then, you know, if something does pop up in your DT, kind of like, you know, what Dan was saying is like, well, instead of just kind of willy-nilly guessing, well, you know that you gave the fish a peroxide bath and you know that these are the diseases it does not address. So these are the most likely culprits of the problem that you're having in your tank.
What would you guys consider, like, what do you guys with your own display tanks, what sort of quarantine measures do you guys take? How do you guys go about it?
So with me, I actually don't have a display tank because I just, you know, not just got done, but I was, I had, well, how many tanks we had in the house? 20, 30?
Yeah.
We had like more.
Oh,
We had like,
wow.
we had like 25 tanks in the house, and it was all centered around,
20 and it grew.
it grew into like 25, 30 tanks, but it was all centered around the business. You know, I had, I don't know, 10 quarantine tanks, 10 retail tanks. I had some auxiliary tanks set up. And in my most recent experience was doing heavy prophylactic treatment because I was, you know, I had to do that for the business. You can't watch 70, 80 fish at a time and just, you know, hope none of them have diseases. But prior to that, when I had my last personal DT, was a 150-gallon tank. I actually was using chloroquine phosphate a lot back then. I would say most fish back then either went through tank transfer method or they went through chloroquine phosphate.
With seahorses, I used to do, if I brought wild caught in, I would do a minimum of 6 weeks, but normally at least 90 days of quarantine. And part of that was because of the deworming process and whatnot that I went through. Because we would deworm with fenbendazole, we would use 3 weeks of treatment with that, 3 weeks with metrodiazole, 3 weeks with Prozi. And then we also wanted to watch to see how they performed, to see if we wanted to add them as brood stock. If I got them from a captive bred source, it was much less because I didn't have to go through all that. They weren't, you know, they're not going to have nematodes. They're not exposed to that type of stuff in a captive environment. When customers ask me, you know, when I sell seahorses, they'll always, I won't say always, but often I get to ask the question, should I quarantine? And my standard response is, you should always quarantine. And they would say, well, what if I'm putting them, they're the only thing going in the tank. So the tank itself is like a quarantine tank. And yeah, I get that. And there's some people that just aren't going to quarantine, and you just have to let them do what they're going to do.
Right.
So for me, my process is a little simpler. I get what I would consider reasonably clean fish. So that's often diver's den or captive bred. They get a 30-minute, 150 ppm peroxide bath, and then they go into the tank, and I dose peroxide at 1 mil per 5 gallons 3 times a day for a month. And I run UV. That's it. But I mean, I've added 10 fish to my 4 various tanks using this method. Haven't lost any of them, and I haven't lost any of my existing fish that I already had doing it. And
Well-
it's just, I'm just not stressed about it, right?
That's the name of the game. But I'm curious, Bobby, if I'm not pitting here against each other, but I'm curious if you disagree. Do you still suggest that everyone quarantine? And this is just combo between friends.
Oh, of course he does. Absolutely.
I think what she's doing is still experimental.
Because
And
many
that's
people
fine. I mean,
have
look,
do well for years, and then all of a sudden, oh shit, right? And I'm
right.
not saying you're wrong, Jessica. I'll shut up now.
Because that does happen. I can't tell you how many times that, I've read about people like, oh, well, I used this organic treatment, or I did this, and the other, and it went away. And then years later, they're like, oh shit, it's back. Especially like, well, so and when it seems to happen is when there's a stressor event. Like, so I live in the Gulf South, hurricanes are common. And when we get hit with a hurricane, power goes out, you can run a generator, but you're going to run out of gas. And most of the people I know, like in the New Orleans area where I'm actually from, that's usually when they would discover that their tank had ick, is they would lose power, temperature would start to fluctuate, whatever. And then these stressor events would then stress the fish's immune system. They couldn't manage the diseases anymore. Next thing you know, you're looking at a wipeout. So I personally consider it to still be experimental. But look, obviously Jessica, look, she's extremely intelligent. She understands the risks, the pros and cons. So I mean, she's prepared to take action if it fails.
She's gonna learn it and share it.
Exactly. So hey, there's nothing wrong with that at all. And I think Jessica, you'd said that you were going to let you weren't going to replace the lamps on your UV to
Right.
Ooh.
So I'm just gonna let the UVs die and see what happens.
Yeah, that was
because
really interesting when you talked about the UV affecting peroxide. Sorry.
yeah, because I can't say for sure whether there's still anything existing in the tank, right? I mean, everybody looks healthy. They're all fat. They all feed well. The clownfish are spawning every 2 weeks. Sick fish don't spawn, right? So, but is that because there's still UV? I'm not dosing peroxide anymore. I actually stopped dosing peroxide, I think, in August. So that's, it's been that long, and the UV on the main tank has been running now for a year without me cleaning the sleeve or changing the lamp. And I'm just gonna let it die off and see if anything shows up. I'm fully aware that this is experimental, and I tell people that absolutely. It's all about risk. And for me, the whole quarantine process, I was losing so many fish going through that, and then the stress of it was just going to drive me out of the hobby. This actually brought it back to enjoyable, right? So I think that's part of it too.
I absolutely love that you guys do different things and we're all coming together and sharing and figuring it out, because there are different ways to be right.
I think I've been through 13 hurricanes and tropical storms ranging from Cat 4 all the way down to the small guys, and even one at sea. I've never lost a seahorse despite the thousands of seahorses I had, even with a 2-week power outage.
Oh, wow.
It's all about preparation and thinking things through ahead of time and being prepared. I used to have on my forum to, what was the quote I had? Failure to prepare is to prepare to fail.
The only time I've actually lost fish, I think, following a hurricane was Katrina. So with Katrina was a unique situation. I was, living in New Orleans at the time. No, so basically, like, I had to evacuate where we lived. It was a mandatory evacuation. I mean, we did have like a generator and everything, but I mean, it was mandatory evacuation. I had to evacuate with my parents because, and we all left. We were at my sister's house, I think, for like 3 weeks, and came home. Everything was dead. And like, I really felt bad for my father because that actually was the thing that finally forced him out the hobby, because he had angels that were 10, 10, 11, 12 years old. And, we're burying them in the front yard. And I mean, it was just such an emotional, I mean, it's like you lost a bunch of dogs and cats basically, because he had them for so long. And I mean, that was the thing that just finally, he couldn't do it anymore.
Yeah, that's tough. I actually replaced seahorses for people in Katrina at a huge discount. Several of my customers were affected, and in fact, one guy, it took him 8 years to get his tank back up and running after he rebuilt his house. I mean, he was flooded out, the whole first floor, and um, I feel for people in those situations. The situation that we had was when Gene came through, we were expecting a Cat 5, Cat 4, Cat 5, and we couldn't leave. If we left, it meant the end of our business. It was stay and make it work or just let it go. Because if we left for 2 or 3 days, we're done.
Right.
And we fortunately, it didn't turn out. It turned out to be a Cat 2. But I have a tremendous amount of respect after watching what Hugo did in Charleston. I know what these damn storms could do. When you start getting into Cat 5, I mean, you're hoping to survive, not just, get through it. You're hoping to actually survive.
Right. Yeah, it can be just devastating.
Hey, Bobby, Jessica, I really, really appreciate you guys coming. Anytime you have time, we would love to have you back.
Sounds good.
Nice meeting you guys.
Yeah,
Thanks,
nice meeting
you
you too. Good night, everyone.
Links to many of the documents we discussed can be found in the comment section on YouTube. Join us every Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern for Wine Wednesday with the Whisperer.